The story we're about to tell may change the way you think about peacekeeping. It starts with the United Nations mission in a part of what is now Croatia. In 1993, Canadian peacekeepers took a dangerous and very courageous stand there. It brought them face to face with death and the horror of ethnic cleansing. But this story does not end there, far from it. Here's Carol Off with a documentary that features exclusive footage of the war in the former Yugoslavia, the Battle of Medak Pocket.
Many villages in the area of Medak in central Croatia have signs to mark them, but few people to live in them.
This woman here did all our laundry.
Tyrone Green and Mike Spellin are driving back into a nightmare they lived 9 years ago when they were Canadian peacekeepers serving in Croatia, when they last drove this country road and confronted the darkest, most evil side of war.
There's a clearing. This is where we found the first body, and it was the woman that was taken out in the center of the field, where they just covered with light shadow of mud. There's a little slough out there. I took pictures of all the ones that we found in our area, and the reason I did that is for some son of a bitch that wouldn't say this never happened. I mean, I was...
The Canadian soldiers had confronted ethnic cleansing, so successful that now, 9 years later, no one lives here. No one came back.
Old barn back in here.
Mike Spellin was a sergeant major for the 2nd Battalion of the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry. Their orders in September 1993 were to do whatever possible to stop a Croat offensive against Serbs living in the Medak Pocket. Tyrone Green, a lieutenant then, now a captain, led the 9th Platoon. He was a reservist. Almost half the Canadian battle group here at the time were also in the reserves. Young men, mostly just out of boyhood, who had signed up for adventure and maybe a chance to help people in faraway places.
There was a kid about 15 feet from me, and he wasn't in my company, so I can't recall his name. But I remember looking at him, he was just staring, and I remember trying to talk to him. I was getting no response. And I mean, it was quite obvious that these guys had seen enough by this point.
What the Canadian soldiers did and saw here 9 years ago is one of the most important and yet untold stories in peacekeeping history. Tyrone Green and Mike Spellin agreed to come back to Croatia with us to tell the story of Medak Pocket and how it marked the men and women of the PPCLI forever.
There it is.
Tyrone takes us to his former base. They called it Medak House. His platoon moved here in August 1993 as part of the UN Protection Force, UNPROFOR. They were to patrol and protect this area, but they found it extremely unstable. Croat and Serb armies were locked in a ceasefire that threatened to break at any moment. Medak House tried to create a sense of security.
The weeks leading up to this whole time, we've been out in the pocket, visiting people, getting to know the locals, employing some of the locals as translators, and we had locals bringing us bread. Coming down to do laundry. There was a little bit of loyalty towards the people as well. We'd adopted a whole bunch of the children coming in every day to play volleyball with the soldiers. You know, we had dogs, we had cats.
Medak is in an area called Krajina. When Croatia declared its independence, the Serbs claimed the Krajina as their own republic. Serb soldiers ethnically cleansed Croats from Krajina and then held their ground until September 1993, when the Croats attacked Medak Pocket. Nothing would stop them, not even UNPROFOR.
our UN flags were on antennas that were tied down. And so when the first time we got fired, as we were just breaching through the Serb lines to come out, we thought, well, maybe they don't really notice it's UN. So we let the antennas go up to show the flag. And
UN flag.
Yeah, and we received more fire. So we decided, well, we got this big flag that was like the size of a bed sheet that we had flying above the Medak house. We'll put that up. And then there's not going to be any way that they're not going to know it's UN forces. So we did that and put the big UN flag up. And then we started taking anti-aircraft fire in the direct roll. So they knew it was UN, and we were trying to push forward.
The Canadians were in the middle of a major Croat offensive, masterminded by the highest leadership, Generals Rahim Ademi and Janko Bobetko. The Croats had a legal claim to the Krajina, but later indictments against the Croat generals state that they plotted to ethnically cleanse Serbs from this area. In 3 days, the Croats took Medak Pocket. UNPROFOR's record of standing up to such attacks on UN-protected areas was dismal. The UN mission was on the brink of failure. In a rare act of defiance, the UN commander ordered the PPCLI to act. The Canadians were to wedge themselves between Croat and Serb forces and push the Croats back. They took up the order with gusto.
Basically, we walked one armored vehicle out at a time, just walked out about 10 feet, took fire, waited a couple seconds, walked it out a little bit farther, and eventually just showed to the Croatians that we weren't leaving. We were going to eventually get out in front of the Serbs and establish our positions.
What followed was the biggest battle Canadian soldiers had confronted since the Korean War. PPCLI's Charlie Company fought a 16-hour continuous firefight against the Croats. The Croats later claimed the Canadians had killed or wounded 27 of their soldiers. The UN began negotiating a ceasefire, but the Croats had already started their next phase.
By that time, their forces had now come down from the mountains and now were sweeping through the Medak Pocket, which is just up in front of us here. And so they had to start scaling off their shelling to allow the ground forces now to start sweeping through and confronting the Serb forces and attacking villages and so on.
Tyrone's company was in the best position to see what the Croats were doing, but he had no orders to stop them.
We could now start observing a number of fires being started, and that was giving us clear indication that ethnic cleansing was occurring, and hence the sense of urgency for the UN to react.
The UN forced the Croat leadership to agree to a ceasefire, but the leadership couldn't or wouldn't tell their commanders on the ground. UNPROFOR met resistance at every turn. The Canadian soldiers would later regret that they hadn't forced their way in. The Canadian commander, Colonel Jim Calvin, called an impromptu press conference in a final effort to shame the Croats into leaving the area.
Today we moved up at 1200 hours precisely, and we found mines on the road and still anti-tank roadblocks blocking our path. The Croatians made a big show of moving the mines and the anti-tank barriers, but now they are refusing to allow us passage, indicating that yet one more Army commander and another Army commander must be here to help guide us into position. At some stage, you got to cut the bullshit and get on with the job. And all I've heard right now from the Croatian people at my level here is a bunch of half-baked excuses aimed at delaying us from getting on with the operation.
The barricade slowly came down and the Canadian peacekeepers entered Medak Pocket. They had fought a pitched battle with Croat soldiers and forced the Croats to withdraw from the area, but they learned they were too late. As they toured one village after another, they had expected to be horrified, but couldn't prepare for what they saw. Lieutenant Colonel Craig King led what was called the sweep team. His job was to find survivors, to recover the dead, and to make a record of what happened.
The first little hamlet that we came to was, we deployed the infantry out to form a cordon. We had the engineers go in to check for mines and to ensure that the structures were safe to enter. And then we started, calling for people, and there was no one.
Let's keep it down! Try your floating. He's Sergeant there!
By nightfall, Craig King's sweep team found the first 2 bodies.
We're lighted here? Yeah, we're gonna hear it just as soon as they get in there. Okay, stand back from the doorway there.
Basically, you can see the body skateboarding, legs.
They were in a terrible state, and if you've ever smelled burnt flesh, you'll never forget it the rest of your life. And it was a very sad event taking them out of there. The body parts were sort of strewn about. This is we probably shouldn't talk about that. Yeah, give me a minute, will you? Okay. Sure.
The Canadians had found the bodies of what appeared to be teenaged girls. At times, they had to douse them with bottled water to reduce the heat.
We loaded them, charred and all, into these body bags, and I think their remains were still so hot that they melted some of the plastic of the body bag. The guys were handling them with gloves and everything like that, and there were bits falling off as we were loading them in. It's just, God, it was horrific. My driver used a whisk broom and a scoop that we had in the Jeep to pick up some of the fingers and things like that. I mean, it was goddamn awful.
Thereafter, once we moved in here,
Mike Spellin went through the
actually
woods
the
looking
mine
for
that comes
survivors,
from the
but
mine
found
that
only
opened
corpses,
themselves out
mostly
to
older
solve
men
that
and
there was
women,
money
but at least
that were
one
picking these
Serb
bodies up.
soldier.
And once we decided there was no booby traps, when we turned this one young guy over, he would have been probably about mid-20s, maybe 25, 27 years of age. And they had tortured this guy before they eye shot him. But I remember when they turned him over, there was a little chain trinket. The chain was running through his fingers. And when we turned him over, I pulled the hand open. And what he had done, if you can imagine probably what he went through his last minutes of life, in there he probably had this chain around his neck, and he had pulled it off and clenched it in his fist, and he never, surprised that they never looted, they probably didn't see it. But he was clenching this chain, no doubt, before he got executed. And what it was 2 hearts that were overlapped. So it was probably from a girlfriend or his wife or something that he was clinging to in his last moments of his life.
Did we save everybody's lives that were in there? No, we didn't. It's always been a bit of a sore point too, but we couldn't have done anything any faster than what we did. We reacted much quicker than well, we were the only unit to react.
Major Dan Drew led Mike Spellin's company.
To witness the results of ethnic cleansing is mind-numbing. I mean, you're talking about old women and men butchered and murdered, tortured, little girls tied to chairs and burned to death. You're talking about all the animals, being burned alive in their barns or shot out in the field. The area being booby-trapped, the water table being poisoned by throwing bodies down wells and then putting rocks on top of them so they can't float to the surface, and then pouring oil in on top of that. The destruction of every building in a region, every building. The roofs blown off, windows knocked out, burned, demolished by mines, that kind of stuff. That's what ethnic cleansing is. It's horrific. It's a moonscape in the end.
Croatian President Franjo Tudjman was very aware of what was happening in Medak. It was in part revenge for what the Serbs had done to them. But transcripts of Tudjman's cabinet meetings released after his death reveal that he considered the Serbs living in Croatia a national problem that must be eliminated. Croatia must resolve the problem by war, said Tudjman, by ethnically cleansing the Serbs from Croatia. Croat General Janko Babetka reports to Tudjman that they have successfully cleansed the area. We turned over 52 usable Serb bodies, says Babetko, but the general is alarmed that perhaps the peacekeepers discovered bodies they weren't supposed to. It could be that Umprofor entered a little too fast, says Babetko. He admits there were bodies hidden in the woods.
We found a total of 16 bodies, I think. We found evidence that there was probably more because in the woods we would see large sort of patches of blood and surgical gloves, which suggest that maybe bodies or something had been dumped there. I don't know.
The Canadian soldiers stayed for several more weeks, always hoping that someone had survived, someone would come back. No one did. The Princess Patricias gave everything they had defending the villages of Medak Pocket. When they left Croatia several weeks later, at least they thought they'd done all that was possible. It would take years before they realized just how much of themselves they had given here in Medak.
My reservists, they went straight from, hell back into the normal world. They went from 150 miles an hour to zero in a heartbeat. And these guys, as soon as they hit the ground, they were basically given a paycheck and sent on their way.
When we come back, the Battle of Medak Pocket, the home front. In October 1993, the 2nd Battalion of the Princess Patricias came home. They went from the scenes of a massive crime into the arms of loved ones in a flash. Many were scattered out across the country in a matter of hours and had little contact again. They couldn't compare notes or symptoms.
But soon after, once the initial euphoria of being back in Canada wears off, then we start thinking a lot about what happened and what we saw, what we observed.
How did it affect you?
Sleepless nights, irritability, a sense of being very lethargic.
I was, edgy. I was irritable. I was lacking patience. We have young children, and it was expressing itself in that way. And
Mike Spellin soon ended his 25-year career as a soldier.
I hit 25 and I just got out. One line or two it may concern. I'm giving my 30 days notice. And a lot of people were surprised because I'd be there to this day. But I had stuff going on with me I didn't know about. I was having nightmares. I wasn't sleeping properly, and I didn't realize at the time, but when I look back, I totally was disconnecting from my family.
Canadian peacekeepers came home with war stories to tell. Stories of what they had done, what they had witnessed, and how it had changed them. They were stories both of courage and of horror, but they couldn't get much of an audience. Defense officials didn't want to hear what had happened in the Medak Pocket. In fact, quite the opposite.
I believe there was a conscious choice in the senior leadership in the department at that point in time to, in a sense, sacrifice the long-term well-being of this group of people for the sake of the reputation and the image of the Canadian Forces at the time.
Joe Sharp is a retired brigadier general formerly with the Canadian Air Force. He studied the effects of stress on soldiers who served in Medak Pocket. Sharp believes the Defense Department wanted to keep the story of Medak Pocket a secret from Canadians.
The fact that the Canadians rescued the UN mandate in Croatia was something that Canadians back here were never ever made aware of. It's a source of tremendous pride, or ought to have been, to the country. But instead, I think we ended up with some of our bureaucrats deciding that, no, Canadians probably aren't well enough informed to understand this. It's better not to let them know, because the headline would read, Canadian soldiers kill Croat forces or Croat citizens, because these folks were a bit of an irregular army. And the danger of that is that that would just be a continuation of what had happened in Somalia. So let's not talk about it.
The Princess Patricias had returned home right in the middle of a different controversy. The Department of National Defense was trying to do damage control over another peacekeeping mission that had gone horribly wrong. Canadian airborne soldiers had tortured a Somali teenager to death.
The Somali inquiry cast a pall over the entire Canadian forces, and for years there was nothing that we could do that was right or good. And certainly I think we began to reap the benefit of that as soon as we got off the airplane. I mean, you know, our families were happy to see us, but you know, in Edmonton when we go away now, people have, you know, yellow ribbon campaigns, and there's you know, people lining the streets when we come back, and flag waving and all the rest of that stuff. Back in those days it was like, okay, get off the plane and you know, meet up with your wife and kids and you know, see you later.
So in the end, I think it was a conscious decision to basically walk away from this and let these guys come back and carry on, and hopefully it'll go away and nobody will notice.
But this man wanted the Defense Department to notice. Matt Stopford had been part of the Medak operation. As years went on, he found that his body was breaking down. He was going blind in one eye, and his body was in chronic pain. Stopford wanted the department to find out why. Joe Sharp was appointed by the Department of National Defense to investigate Stopford's illness. It was 6 years after the events in Medak. Initially, they thought the problem might be toxic material in the soil used to fill sandbags in Croatia. The inquiry would find the answer wasn't that simple. So many soldiers were ill. Mike Spellin knew there was something wrong with him. He got his best chance to find out what it was when he was asked to be part of the inquiry.
And when I got the phone call, Colonel Marsh said, you know, we need an answer by tomorrow, and I gave it to him right away. I said, I'll give it to you now. I said, yeah, I'll be a member on the board, because I know my concern was I knew these guys that were sick.
They had digestive problems, they had joint problems, they had sleeping problems, they were having difficulty with anger management and vision problems, memory problems. It started, as soon as a guy sat down and started talking, we knew he was going to tell us he was having digestive problems, that he hadn't had a solid bowel movement, for example, since he'd come back from Croatia.
In the course of the inquiry, the story of Medak Pocket came to light for the first time. As it did, it exposed the fallacy of peacekeeping. In the 1990s, for soldiers in blue berets, there was often no peace to keep. Canadian soldiers faced combat and witnessed atrocities, and the Canadian public knew almost nothing about it. The Sharp inquiry took 6 months and was never able to find a physiological source of Stopford's or anyone's illness. But the Defense Department got its first glimpse of a growing problem, an epidemic of post-traumatic stress disorder in the Canadian forces. So what did you conclude as to why these people were sick?
We concluded that primarily it was probably a result of psychological injury, stress, operational stress injury, PTSD, in the vast majority of cases.
While in Croatia, Mike Spellin was looking for a family that had been most special to him. On our last day, Mike finds another family that he knew. He hopes they have news.
I was Canadians in '93 on the Hill.
Sjećate se kad su bili Kanađani tu?
Znam,
sjećam. Svuda si davaš smo vodu.
Sergeant Major, give you water.
Yeah. Sjećam se sad,
Yeah.
Ajte unutra. Ajte unutra.
Mike learns that they all survived. They fled before the offensive began.
You know, our worst fears was that they met the same tragic that people did in Medak pocket. So for me to come over here and find out that the one family's still living there and they confirm that the other ones are alive meant quite a bit to me.
Some of the peacekeepers who served in Croatia are now getting treatment for PTSD. Countless others are not even diagnosed. There is one important development for these soldiers, though. On December 1st, they will receive a Governor General's citation in special recognition of what they did in Medak Pocket. For The National, I'm Carol Off in Medak, Croatia.